Absence in Common, an Operator for an Inoperative Community by Kevin Hamilton. I have intimated that, especially in a secular context, a commonly desired ultimate foundation or ground is full unity. Community or consensus, which is often, if not typically, figured as lost or perhaps lacking, usually because of the intrusive presence of others seen as outsiders or polluters of the city or the body politic. One may, however, insist that such unity, community, or consensus is absent, and that the socio-political problem is how to deal with that absence, as well as the differences and forms of conflict that accompany it. Dominic LaCarpra, Trauma, Absence, Loss. This paper will argue for the relevance of a phenomenology of presence to a discussion of where and how a community domain is possible. As an ideal within modernity, community has enjoyed remarkable staying power. Dreams of universal language, perfectly organized spaces, and augmented conversation never seem to lose their allure. But as the refuse of failed utopias mounds high, many people question whether ideals of community have not hurt more than they have helped. Among the skeptics are philosophers and political theorists, artists and historians of technology. Significant about this body of critique is that communication itself and the technological means by which it is achieved have emerged as an important and material way in which ideals of community are habitualized and inscribed into culture. Community, communication, and communion. In Speaking into the Air, A History of the Idea of Communication, John Durham Peters examines communication as a historicized cultural form, one that has inhibited our ability to actually relate to one another. In Peters' history, ideal and authentic communication between individuals typically takes the form of wordless exchange, a perfect transfer in which mediation falls away to allow for fusion of souls. As far back as Plato, and driven home by modern mass communication, misconnections drive the desire for less material form of social relations. Our ideals and technologies trap us within a cycle of utopia and dystopia. Too often, Peters writes, communication misleads us from the task of building worlds together. It invites us into a world of union without politics, understandings without language, and souls without bodies, only to make politics, language, and bodies reappear as obstacles rather than blessings. The fully realized person of individualistic or communistic humanism is the dead person, writes Jean-Luc Nancy in a related work, The Inoperative Community. Nancy shares Peters' concern for how often difference is treated as a barrier to be overcome, or a boundary that defines the fully realized person. When Peters urges us to celebrate the mutable and faulted nature of language, Nancy calls for a new definition of subjecthood. As singular beings rather than individuals, we come into being through recognizing the boundaries of the self at another. Community results not from fusion with another or through autonomous subscription to a common body, but through the mutual acknowledgement of difference. Selfhood emerges only where one person ends and another, or even death, begins. Nancy writes, communication consists before all else in this sharing and this co-appearance of finitude. That is, in the dislocation and in the interpolation that reveal themselves to be constitutive of being in common precisely inasmuch as being in common is not common being. Only in this communication are singular beings given, without a bound and without communion, equally distant from any notion of connection or joining from the outside and from any notion of a common and fusional interiority. Common to the problematic ideals identified by Nancy and Peters is a failure to account for absence, the absence of being and selfhood beyond the limits of one's own sensorium. Instead of recognizing the limits of death or difference as that which we hold in common, utopian communicants attempt to transcend death through pursuit of universal language, or extension of the self into a common being that cannot abide difference. Enacted absence. Importantly, for new media practitioners, Peters believes that we realize and routinize such reactions to absence through our technologies of communication. He traces a helpful and now familiar history in which 19th century spiritualism directly influences early understanding of telegraphy, telephony, eventually satellites, and even the search for extraterrestrials. Across these attempts to communicate lies a common test for presence, a test coincident with the test for limits to the self. At the seance, a medium pings the wooden table to see if a spirit will rap in return, and contact with the world beyond is constituted through an echo, an aural mirror, also a disjunction of sense and belief. The presence of an other is only achieved through a break of time and space, a detachment of the senses. Lee Eric Schmidt demonstrates how such an epistemological break serves even secularist agendas through a re-education of the senses, based on enacted absence. In his book, Hearing Things, Religion, Illusion, and the American Enlightenment, Schmidt tells of scientists examining oracle statues with stethoscopes and traveling magicians who recreate Delphi through props and speaking tubes. Each performance of simulated oral revelation concluded by pulling back the curtain, allowing audience members to then speak through the mouth of a goddess. In these histories of telepresence, absence is either quickly filled, even haunted, or left gaping to revisit as a fetishized site of trauma. The structural trauma of realizing one's own finitude, and the impossibility of community, or sometimes divinity. In his study, The Concept of Ether by which absence is often materialized, Joe Maludis quotes the early Russian radio artist Klebnikov. Where has this great stream of sound come from? This inundation of the whole country in supernatural singing, and the sound of beating wings, this broad silver stream full of whistlings and clangor, and marvelous mad bells surging from somewhere we are not, mingling with children's voices singing and the sound of wings. Over the center of every town in the country these voices pour down, a silver shower of sound, amazing silver bells filled, mixed with whistlings surge down from above, and these perhaps the voices of heaven, spirits flying low over the farmhouse roof. Our technologies of presence set us up to expect communication and connection where it will never happen, to imagine community in ways that are bound to fail. How might telepresent technology instead acknowledge absence without fetishizing it, abhor the void without filling it? Neither Peters nor Nancy address this question in detail, though their analysis fully articulate the need. If the histories related by Schmidt and others are any indication, we will need to answer this question through practice as well as theory. First, however, I would like to enlist one other area of discourse, that of trauma and memory, especially as manifest in memorial spatial, oral, and pictorial practices. The trauma of absence. Failures to confront absence in communication bear close resemblance to failures to confront and work through the experience of trauma. As we benefit from a large body of work analyzing material responses to trauma, perhaps we might answer the calls of Peter or Nancy through some cross-disciplinary discussion. Telemediated experience, photography, and even the recorded voice rely on some small set of data to bridge a temporal-spatial gap between persons. Likewise, recovery from trauma involves the utilization of present sensory experience to bridge a temporal gap introduced by traumatic dislocation of senses and consciousness. Victims of trauma work through their experience after having perceived it. As the brain cannot comprehend the event in real time, only remnants are available for examination. As part of recovery, victims and witnesses revisit the site of trauma through material recreation or inscription. Important to this possibly dangerous analogy, however, are some distinctions made by Dominic LaCapra. He describes recovery from trauma as a process of separating absence from loss, where loss involves a particular historical event and absence the perception of something is missing that was never present to begin with. Conflation or confusion of these is part of traumatic experience, but could also result from an inappropriate identification with another's loss, mistaking felt absence for experienced loss. Failure to properly distinguish between the two can have disastrous consequences. When absence is converted into loss, one increases the likelihood of misplaced nostalgia or utopian politics in quest of a new totality or fully unified community. When loss is converted into or encrypted in an indiscriminately generalized rhetoric of absence, one faces the impasse of endless melancholy, impossible mourning, and interminable aporia in which any process of working through the past and its historical losses is foreclosed or prematurely aborted. Treated as loss, absence pushes witnesses to fill voids that cannot be filled, through retaliation or through misplaced identification with real victims. Alternately, a witness or victim may choose to preserve the void and revisit the site of perceived historical loss with compulsive regularity. To blur the distinction between or to conflate absence and loss may itself bear striking witness to the impact of trauma and the post-traumatic, which create a state of disorientation, agitation, or even confusion, and may induce a gripping response whose power and force of attraction can be compelling. The very conflation attests to the way one remains possessed or haunted by the past, whose ghosts and shrouds resist distinctions, such as that between absence and loss. Indeed, in post-traumatic situations in which one relives or acts out the past, distinctions tend to collapse, including crucial distinction between then and now, wherein one is able to remember what happened to one in the past but realize one is living in here and now with future possibilities. I would argue that the response of even secondary witnesses, including historians, to traumatic events must involve empathic unsettlement that should register in one's very mode of address in ways of revealing both similarities and differences across genres, such as history and literature. But a difficulty arises when the virtual experience involved in empathy gives way to vicarious victimhood, and empathy with the victim seems to become an identity, and a post-traumatic response of unsettlement becomes questionable when it is routinized in a methodology or style that enacts in compulsive repetition, including the compulsively repetitive turn to aporia, paradox, or impasse. LeCarpre's descriptions of conflated absence and loss are reminiscent of utopian attempts at community or communication, which typically blur distinctions between self and other, then and now, here and there. Reading Nancy or Peters through LeCarpre, the absence of perfect communion with others is sometimes misconstrued as an Edenic loss, a historic fall from which we must struggle to recover. For all three of these scholars, we ignore this void, or fill it to the peril of ourselves and others. In a secularized world, there has been no golden time of communion, no perfect place of immanence and clear transfer of thought, nor will there be. Yet new media are both lauded and derided as the progenitors or destroyers of such a place. LeCarpre alludes to ways in which absence misunderstood as loss can manifest itself in destructive forms of nationalism. He also identifies in such confusion a more subtle violence towards difference, through misplaced empathy that folds the other, the real victim, into the self. To violently empathize is to expand the space of the self, constructing social symmetry where there is none. Certainly there are echoes here of the ways in which telecommunication constructs symmetry, social experiences that mask or obscure the real power dynamics at work. Alternately, if in communication we decline to fill the void of absence, we are still often predisposed to fetishizing it, revisiting the wound with compulsive regularity. We scan the stations for a signal, lift the receiver to see if anyone is on the party line, perhaps even compulsively recheck our mail. Like Donnie Darko's Beckett hero Roberta Sparrow, we spend our days pacing back and forth to see if the void is still there in the mailbox. Representing traumatic loss. Space. Turning back to the comparison of absence, community, and trauma, what might we learn from memorial responses to traumatic loss? Remaining alert to the danger of equating absence with historical loss, what might we learn from spatial, pictorial, or oral attempts to recover from trauma? In his book, Present Pasts, Urban Palimpsests and Politics of Memory, Andreas Hyacin surveys recent attempts to grapple with loss through monument and public space. With Berlin as a focus, he discusses Christos wrapping of the Reichstag and commercial redevelopment of a war-razed Potsdamer Platz before turning to Lipskind's Jewish Museum. Maya Lin's popular Vietnam memorial prompted a near institutionalization of the physical void as a way of remembering loss, and Berlin has more than its share of holes. Hyacin outlines some of the dangers of preserving absence before lauding Lipskin's design, in which a jagged meander of a building is transcended by a series of inaccessible spaces. Visitors encounter these humanless voids through interior windows from every floor, but can never enter. He writes, "There is a danger of romanticizing or naturalizing the voided center of Berlin, just as Lipskin's building may ultimately not avoid the reproach of aestheticizing or monumentalizing the void architecturally. But then the very articulation of this musal space demonstrates the architect's awareness of the dangers of monumentality. Huge as the expression is, the spectator can never see or experience it as a whole. Both the void inside and the building as perceived from outside elude the totalizing gaze upon which monumental effects are predicated." Husson is aware of the dangers outlined by LaCarpra, especially when manifest in the design of public space. To pretend as if here had been no loss would of course be unjust, and would inhibit recovery from trauma. On the other hand, to fetishize the void through piles of shoes, or the glass chairs of Oklahoma City, or the reconstructed footprint holes of the World Trade Center, is to encourage mourning that is both nonspecific and too easily grasped. At best, it facilitates inappropriate identification with the victims, and at worst endangers the memory of specific atrocities through abstraction. For Husson, Lipskin avoids these dangers through the construction of a void that is beyond full human comprehension, but which is still visible from the periphery. Like historical loss, the void in the Jewish Museum has a finite shape and existence in the world, but it is not one easily known or ordered. Though only a simple axis, Lipskin's void emerges unpredictably, asserting itself back into the path of the museum visitor. We are prevented from projecting ourselves fully into these spaces, as there are always some portions obscured from view. They cannot be ours. The design preserves rather than obscures the traumatic break between knowledge and perception. The real loss remains larger than we can imagine, beyond rational scale, yet we are given an analogical sensory experience that resists metonymy, and perhaps even metaphor. Lipskin has facilitated a site of recovery from trauma that utilizes space to make loss physical, sensory, and thus seemingly obvious, yet ultimately not assumable into experience. For witnesses as distinct as those born in another century and another continent, the experience still attempts to bridge a gap of sense, yet without succumbing to the ungrantable desire to know what it was like. Representing traumatic loss. Image. Where Husson and Lipskin seek to facilitate recovery through spatial organization, others have approached the process as temporal, through image or sound. In Spectral Evidence, Ulrich Bahr explores the interrelated temporalities of trauma and photography, with an emphasis on representations of the Jewish Holocaust. Some pictures, according to Bahr, resist conventional comprehension as a frozen moment within a stream of time. As in traumatic experience, these images seem to establish their own time, remaining apart from history and defying contextualization. He goes on to wonder if perhaps all photography might share this quality. If we analyze photographs exclusively through establishing the context of their production, we may overlook the constitutive breakdown of context that, in a structural analogy to trauma, is staged by every photograph. In some photographs, the impression of timelessness coincides with the strange temporality and contradictory sense of the present surrounding the experience depicted. To analyze images that focus on such interruptions and loss of context, therefore, it is not sufficient to refer to the extrapictorial, social, and psychic formations of the photograph's author's reader. Rather, we must consider such photographs in the light of the Eduardo Cadava has identified as the peculiar structure that lies between the photographic image and any particular referent, which is, in fact, the absence of relation. This absence of relation may come into focus when reading photography through trauma theory, and vice versa, when reading trauma theory through the starting effect of reality created by photography. Photographs present their referents as peculiarly severed from the time in which they were shot, thus precluding simple recourse to the context established by individual and collective forms of historical consciousness. Bahr's account invites us to see pictures and is analogous to the sensory evidence of traumatic event. Though we may desire a reconstruction of the original event using available data, the gap between sense and history is ultimately impossible to close. A picture invites either inclusion in the present or placement in a specific past. through attachment to a particular referent. For Barr, neither is possible nor desirable. For examples of this, he looks to the concentration camp photographs of Michiel Leven and Dirk Reinartz. In each case, the picture is neither conventionally picturesque nor compositionally resistant to the gaze. Instead of architectural ruins or other obvious signs of trauma, we see an unremarkable yet accessible landscape. A title or published context invites closer inspection in order to place a banal image in the context of known historical atrocities. Because they do not contain evidence of their importance, these photographs ask to be regarded on strictly modernist terms, as if their significance and merit derive not from our knowledge of context but from intrinsic formal criteria alone. By representing the Holocaust in such stringently formal terms, Reinartz and Leven force us to see that there is nothing to see there, and they show us that there is something in a catastrophe as vast as the Holocaust that remains inassimilable to historicist or contextual readings, just when they posit the event as radically singular, and thus when they risk investing absence with spiritual meaning. Reinartz and Leven retract the promise that we can transcend the photograph void to reach some comprehensive and thus consoling meaning. We are left with a picture that refers only to absence, an absence that implicates us in our desire to assimilate another time into ours. Referring to the images more often associated with death camps, Barr writes, "The rush of moral indignation that often accompanies the encounter with other graphic pictures of atrocities may be narcissistically satisfying, but it may also free us from the responsibility of placing our own experiences in relation to something that remains, finally incomprehensible. Like the gaps between beings, like the end of self, these atrocities invite assimilation into our world, but ultimately refuse it." Through the use of perspective and conventional pictorial composition, the photos of Reinartz and Leven invite involvement by the viewer. Textual identification of the horrible and visible histories of these sites pushes the viewer back out again. Barr describes the tension as catching the viewer between place, belonging, and space, exclusion, leaving her to confront her own subject position, a phrase he borrows from Le Carpre. The only ways out of this dilemma are sentimental identification with the lost victim, or restoration of sense to the image through its location within an archive. The former violently asserts subjectivity at the expense of acknowledging an unknowable loss. The latter uses objectivity as pretenses for an equally violent refusal to confront the singularity of the event. Like Nancy's singular being, a visitor to Berlin's Jewish Museum remains no more or less isolated from others or from loss. Likewise, viewers of Barr's photography confront the gap between time and that of a victim's downfall. They look and compare, at first experiencing confusion before growing gradually more aware of their own position in a space of multiple and discontinuous times in his histories. At the time of photography, a viewer discovers her beginning. Representing dramatic loss. Sound. Responsible application of memorial practice toward a technologized sensorium of beings in common requires that we examine the oral as well as the spatial, temporal, and pictorial. Sonic representations of dramatic loss are not hard to find. The events of September 11, 2001 yielded numerous and powerful artifacts. We could listen to the recordings of artist Stephen Vitellio, who before 9/11 captured wind noise on a window of the World Trade Center's 91st floor, or to Mark Band's record of sounds of impact and collapse via seismic recordings made in Manhattan. Janet Cardiff's 40-part motet, coincidentally on display at PS1, became a de facto monument to loss for many. The aspirationally democratic Sonic Memorial collected audio artifacts in an online archive. We might even listen to recently released recordings of emergency calls by stranded Trade Center workers. In these eerie cut-ups, the victims' voices have been edited out by court order, though breathing is still audible over the responses of dispatchers. Ultimately, however, the most applicable artifacts for our project are the unlikely sonic moments of Richard Basinski's The Disintegration Loops. What began as a formal exercise in private melancholy suddenly found enormous public resonance, eventually reaching critical acclaim and unheard-of popularity for an avant-garde experience. During August and September of 2001, Basinski digitally recorded the degradation of decades-old magnetic tape loops, remnants of former projects. On each track, a simple and pastoral musical phrase repeats regularly, dirge-like and elegiac, for as little as 12 minutes or as long as an hour, until the tape loop presumably falls apart. Gaps and distortions grow progressively worse. To play these fragile loops was literally to destroy them. And we are hearing their last performance, already a poignant meditation in ephemerality and the passing of one form to another at millennium ends. The disintegration loops found a whole new function on September 11th. As the artist worked that day, he watched the planes hit and the towers fall through his window in Brooklyn. Basinski and friends then went to the roof, where he finished the project as the smoke continued to rise and the world sank into a whole new political dynamic. The 4 compact discs of the disintegration loops are incredibly and surprisingly moving. Each disc's cover contains the same image at different stages of dusk, a view from afar of the World Financial Center dome, visible beneath a plume of smoke in the growing darkness. Like bearers chosen for photographs, Basinski's tracks invite an unverifiable association through contextual narrative. Listening to the recordings, we hear nothing to indicate the presence of the burning pile across the river. As the piece is more musical than pictorial, we lack even the benefit of perspectival space to invite us in. In its place, however, we are offered sentiment, the sentiment of Satie-like melodies, of Eno's ambience, and 2 decades or more of moody electronic synthesis. The phrases invite emotion, constructing safety through repetition and assuring chords. As each loop breaks down, however, 2 things happen. The music forms in analogical relation to the trade center and the lives lost, and we are literally prevented from listening to it. The closer disintegration loop comes to closing the gap between representation and referent, the more impossible it is for us to hear it. Less satisfactory examples reveal the power of Basinski's project. Compare this work to the equally repetitive video clips on network news at the time, or to the sensational sound collage that begins Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11. In the former, repetition compulsively preserves the traumatic site of perceptual disjunction. In the latter, an attempt at reconstructive representation invites us to imagine that day in vivid detail, yet without a space for mourning or reflection. The disintegration loops preserve absence without fetishizing or colonizing it. They leave the gap of sense and consciousness intact, but facilitate mourning through separation of absence from loss. The people and places of the World Trade Center were lost, along with perhaps a particular identity for New York. We may feel that we lost other things, security, for example, or a continuous and rational sense of time, or a reliable sensorium in which perception results in comprehension. But these were never present to begin with. Critic David Keenan wrote in his review of the project for The Wire, "Its process of decomposition mirrors one way people work through their memories of disaster. Basinski describes both processes as simply letting go of the important sustains. But the music speaks for itself and in much more poignant terms than any act of autodestructive art for art's sake. Subjected to the uncontrollable chance factor of tape decay, the disintegration loops is sound as matter being, seized by time. The remorseless logic of the destruction counterpointing the staggered decay of memory." Among the most unsettling qualities of Basinski's project is that once each loop has died, we can push a button to replay the digital record, resurrecting the dead only to re-experience the process of passing. Though the tendencies towards unhelpful preservation of absence through repetition are there, this discontinuity also maintains distance between the representation and referent. The loops in the end were simply tape. The listener's subject imagines any other connection. Design for a phenomenology of acknowledged absence. Nancy and Peters also begin to demonstrate the destructive effects of expecting community or communion where there can be none. Indeed, some of the more traumatic events of the past century can be linked to such utopias. In the end, though, comparison of failed communication to trauma functions better as the level of structural and phenomenological experience than at the political or even moral levels. Particularly in the example of telecommunication, Both trauma and communication involve a temporal or spatial break, in which present phenomena provide the only bridge to the other side, as well as confirmation of the impossibility of closing the gap. This paper's cited examples demonstrate ways in which this gap may be negotiated using built space or the technologies of recorded sound or image. We require bodily sensory manifestations of felt absence as a way of enacting the limits to communication, and of reminding ourselves about difference. We also need to be wary of the dangers of extracting such absences, preserving them solely for the purposes of vicarious participation in the suffering of others, or of re-experiencing trauma as a way of realizing autonomy. Based on this brief survey of embodied memorial practices, I would venture the following guidelines for constructing more constructive and progressive telepresent experiences. 1. Create an experience that is bigger than the body's sensory capacities, but not so big as to be perceived as monumental or ineffable. 2. Work through synchronization, simultaneity, or spatial illusion to facilitate perceived co-presence, but do not leave the illusion undisturbed. 3. Design for specific ruptures and breaks at the levels of form, content, or context. Take care not to let these ruptures form the focus or end of the work. Certainly these suggestions resemble familiar modernist approaches to media as simultaneously transparent and opaque, hot and cool. Heeding LaCarpra's warning, however, I discourage such reflexivity or remediation solely in the service of paradox. There are a myriad ways in which two persons might share a space, a time, a perceptual set, without pretending to union or retreating to isolation. For Jean-Luc Nancy's inoperative community, reflexivity constitutes acknowledgement of the other, not the self. We need interfaces and networks that facilitate just this sort of connection, and we need them to appear unexpectedly, not in the safe spaces of the gallery or festival. Others have examined how the human operator experts of our networks once functioned in this way, as agents of mediums through which information flowed with varying degrees of ease and attention to the process. Even apart from the politics of placing persons in such a position, we are certainly beyond the technological need for such a labor-dependent network. Perhaps, however, as our artificial agents and operators grow smarter, we might train them to facilitate remote connection with more attention to the need for resistance, for reminders of the chasms that constitute community. Appendix Application. Unfortunately, examples of new media projects that demonstrate constructive acknowledgement of absence are hard to find. Since negative examples could serve in applied discourse as well, I will offer here a brief discussion of some better and worse attempts at telemediated community domain. Any of these works would merit a longer examination. This effort is intended to briefly demonstrate application of this paper's premise. Post-Secret. Frank Warren. Post-Secret by Frank Warren. On this blog, Frank Warren posts without comment the handmade mailed postcards of anonymous people who wish to share a secret. Whether or not the project originated in new media discourse, Post-Secret applies a strategy that is quite common in explicitly social applications of digital media. As in any number of projects, viewers are invited to contribute to the perceived shared space of a web page, one at a time. Strangers get a chance at the podium of a weekly blog post, where they share a secret no one else has heard. These participants have certainly found an audience. As I write, the project is in book form, ranks at 75 on Amazon's popularity list. The problem with this strategy, as in many such works, lies in the identification and production of subjectivity with self-contained difference through formal variation. Each postcard's distinguishing handmade qualities metonymously represent the speaker, lend authenticity to the secret, and lend the project an appearance of inclusivity and diversity. A particular community domain is here comprised of an automistic archive in which no individual stands in different relation to any other. Though Warren provides links to a suicide hotline and even a testimonial as to how the page helps others know that they are not alone in their secrets, I would argue that such projects ultimately fetishize solitude and compound the pain of isolation. The project facilitates no substantive interrelation between contributors, or between contributors and readers, despite the painful, polemical, and politicized context of some of the secrets. In a departure from normative blog practice, not even comments are allowed. Post-Secret almost perfectly captures the non-participatory status of representative democracy in the United States and the role of formalism or style as a substitute for subjectivity in capitalism. Like the worst attempts at memorializing public loss, Warren's domain ignores a gaping absence of discourse under the guise of facilitating a safe public space and encourages vicarious participation in the pain of others. Post-Secret lies on fear of communication between familiars as motivation for participation in a community of strangers that owe each other nothing, and yet appear to be part of something. Here one gets the appearance of filled absence, without surrendering the fetishized void. In Network by Michael Mandenberg and Julia Steinmetz. Commissioned by Turbulence.org, In Network consisted of a month-long multimedia blog. For all of March 2005, the couple Michael Mandenberg and Julia Steinmetz posted every image, text message, or phone conversation shared between them. As they had been recently separated by Mandenberg's move to New York, this was no small amount of information. The pair pushed their service providers' offer of free in-network calls past the limit, including at least one night spent sleeping together over a live cellular connection. The project presents a curious intersection of alienation and banality. Like most surveillance footage, there is almost nothing of interest here for the voyeur, and in fact, the invitation into another couple's world is quite exclusionary. Seemingly no recognition of an outside audience takes place. We do not know what they are talking about half the time, and even the text messages are presented just as sent, in abbreviated and opaque IM speak. Due to the original deployment of the project through podcasts and RSS feeds, reception and after the fact takes some memento-like reconstruction. The posts appear in reverse order for each day. The opacity and insularity of the project begs the question of why they made the exchange public at all. In Network is an elaborate fiction, by never alluding to the presumably watching public, but purposely pushing everything, except emails, out there for us to see. Steinmetz and Mandenberg construct an opaque and fairly boring narrative for us. What do they achieve for themselves and others? Admittedly, I have not listened to every sound file, but it troubles me that they never seem to explicitly address their relationship to each other, or to us as determined and shaped by these chosen media. Beyond some cloying exchanges about how many seconds remain until they are reunited, we see no overt comparison to telemediated experience to share physical experience, and so I assume they must be content with the product offered them by commerce. It is hard not to see the couple as blithe to the impact of absence on relationships. The two might have better included the audience through a more structured performance, or a more overt and faulted exploration of their own limits. By refusing to do so, these artists demonstrate utopian faith in the power of networks to supply surrogate presence. The month's documentation becomes like one giant post-secret card, dismissible as the sentiment of an isolated couple who believe themselves to be one despite the geographical gap between them. If their demographic did not represent a dominant power, young, white, cosmopolitan, and mobile, the project could be accused of exoticization through refusal to address the function of public display. Otherness is left totally unexamined through their own lack of mutual exploration and the neglect of our role in the process. This project could learn a thing or two from Coco Fusco and Guillermo Gomez Peña's Couple in the Cage, or even Dan Graham's Past Futures Split Attention. Mojave Phone Booth. The Mojave Phone Booth was an accidental telemediated experience, a highly unusual physical and virtual destination for a few years until the Park Service removed it. The remnant of a once busy mining community, the functional phone booth appeared as a dreamlike apparition of urban infrastructure in the middle of a remote desert landscape. Boosted by word of mouth and early internet exposure, the phone became a busy hub of activity for callers and drivers from around the world. Through incoming calls from people who found the number online or in print, or through outgoing calls from tourists on the hunt for a legend, the desert payphone sometimes stayed busy around the clock. Visitors to the booth often camped out all night, taking shifts answering anonymous calls. The site held a beautifully complex yet infinite nexus of communicative scenarios. Consider all of the possible callers. The person who calls from outside and has visited the booth. The person who calls from outside and has never visited the booth. The person who answers the phone on site. The call out from the booth to friends or family who have never visited or perhaps even heard of the booth. The call out from the booth to friends or family who have visited the booth. The person who calls out from the booth to a stranger. The call to the booth answered. The call to the booth unanswered. The call from the booth answered. The call from the booth unanswered. Consider all the combinations therein. The ways in which each completed or incompleted call varies. Every case involves some combination of a familiar and unfamiliar, known and unknown, for the caller and the receiver. As gathered from the documentary, Mojave Mirage, a typical scenario might go like this. Phone rings. Someone standing around the booth answers. Caller. Am I really calling a phone booth in the middle of a desert? Receiver. Yeah. Believe me, I'm right here. It's crazy. You wouldn't believe it if you saw it. Who is this? Where are you calling from? Caller. Germany and Berlin. Receiver. No way, for real? I've never talked to anyone from Germany. What's it like? The project retains a perceptual rupture. Neither caller can really imagine what the other is seeing, and perhaps even doubts the veracity of the claim. Telemediated conversations between strangers or familiars alternate between attention to the medium. Can you believe this thing? It's surreal, and attention to the other person or site through description or questions. Of course, as in any such opportunity for anonymous and distanced interaction with strangers, callers on either end explored and crossed lines of intimacy. Here, however, the recipient of an unwanted advance held the full and public power to respond through hanging up, cutting off the other from access to the experience before sharing the experience with others. What did he say? Ooh, what a pig. Callers and visitors describe achieving a sense of communitas, of elated and temporary belonging. One caller is quoted, "It helps make people again." The Mojave phone booth fulfilled the desire for connection, for community, for communication, without pretending to remove the gaps and differences between persons. Each call brought home the contrast between two spaces and two people. But that disparity became a subject of wonderment and propelled conversation forward. Simultaneous and heterogeneous networks grow over at least two forms of telecommunication, intersecting with and embedded in the physical world. These networks were temporary and ephemeral, but not dystopian, contingent and even vulnerable without aestheticizing the void. Transitions by Ulrich Watchmeister. This project exists only as a proposal, but still serves as a useful example. The winning entry from 2004's Fused Space Competition, Transitions asks us to imagine a particularly epistemological, social, spatial scenario, one that richly engages absence between strangers as a site of contemplating loss. Watchmeister's project identifies an important need in the process of separating absence from loss after the death of a loved one. Those who grieve without a specific and finite space for social, public remembrance risk the forgetting historical loss, leaving only the absence of a companion or family member. For those who choose secular means of burial, in particular through the dispersion of cremains to the wind, earth or sea, no such space exists. Transitions imagines a new company that meets this need in two parts, one physical, geographical, the other virtual, through provision of online memorials via websites. Pepper Home Ltd. invites survivors to engage in personal memorial pages, condolences, correspondence, and support groups, where this virtual space serves as a finite destination for international visitors. The coterminous physical site consists solely of transitory anonymous encounters. There, Watchmeister proposes a field of solar-powered lamps that light up on occasion of a visit to one of the virtual memorials. She locates this field on the artificial island of Pepperholm, which currently hosts only a transition from bridge to tunnel for commuters between Copenhagen and Malmö. No one may stop on Pepperholm, they only pass through. A passenger driver passes through Pepperholm at night, glimpses a lit lamp before vanishing into a tunnel. Assuming she is aware of the project, she can imagine her thoughts going to at least two absent persons, the grieved and the grieving. Both are strangers to her, but were familiar to each other. Both are absent from our community perception, one by an immeasurable and unknowable distance of time and space, the other by an immeasurable physical distance but a finite temporal gap. She knows where and when in virtual space the grieving survivor is located. This knowledge is reciprocated through the survivor's awareness of a public manifestation on Purple Home. The two share a moment, as well as a constructively asymmetrical experience of absence. The commuter experiences death in this project only as an abstraction, but is aware that an unreachable specificity is painfully clear to another person, as if the names of the Maya Lin's monument were visible only to the families of the lost. Transitions foregoes creation of an unfounded empathy or connection with others in favor of mutual recognition of the distance caused by loss. Spanning memorial and communicative practices, Transitions employs telemediation and multiple physical and virtual spaces to produce an asymmetrical and temporary connection between strangers. Founded on loss and refusing anyone a permanent stay, Watchmaster's connection is another helpful example of founding community on the impossibility of communion. Isophone by the Human Connectedness Group, MIT Media Lab, Europe, James Auger, Jimmy Lozow, Stefan Agamanoulis. Isophone originated within a research group of the now-defunct European branch of the MIT Media Lab. The mission and projects of this group, now a static archive, bear deep examination in light of this paper's premise. Much of the work represents a likely application of acknowledged absence to telemediated experiences and finds continued resonance in other research efforts. Examination and historicization of the lab's rhetoric and products would assuredly help hone an applied phenomenology of absence. Ultimately, however, many of the projects fell prey to utopian individualist ideals. LaCarpra offers a sobering warning against misplaced desire to the form of limitless pursuit of an infinite series of displacements in quest of a surrogate for what has presumably been lost. Such pursuit inevitably takes the form of melancholy. When absence approximated to loss becomes the object of mourning, the mourning may, perhaps must, become impossible and turn continually back into endless melancholy. The approximation or even conflation of absence and loss induces a melancholic, impossibly mournful response to the closure of metaphysics, a generalized hauntology, and even a dubious assimilation or at least an insufficiently differentiated treatment of other problems, notably a limit event such as the Holocaust and its effects on victims with respect to a metaphysical or meta-metaphysical frame of reference. This description uncannily captures the collective projects of the Human Connectedness Group and, admittedly, of the more dangerous applications of this paper, particularly when examined in light of the group's location within a research-driven, consumerist economy. Isophone is among the most captivating of their efforts as well as the most sobering. For this project, illustrated in a melancholic video, two individuals separated by great distances are united via a symmetrical telemediated experience. Each person in this case, perhaps a woman and her ex-boyfriend, enters a swimming pool and dons a singular piece of headgear. The isophone helmet wholly encloses the face and head, obscuring vision and supplying a live audio connection with the other communicant. 3 attached buoys allow the user to hang from the helmet like a noose, an arrangement that looks surprisingly uncomfortable on video. Here, sensory deprivation appears to create a common space, a perceptual bridge intended to parallel the telephonic link. Isophone's creators describe it as a telephonic communication space of heightened purity and focus. On the video, the reunited couple catches up on where each of them lives, which friends they are in touch with. As in network, we are invited, for the sake of documentation, to observe one couple's attempt at connection. Also like that project, the effort appears to be a success. "We should try to do this more," she concludes. It is an uncomfortable experience to watch for very different reasons. The camera is forced to choose between views of the head or views of the swimsuit-clad body beneath the surface, an uncanny and objectifying gesture that colors any understanding of the concept. We watch two mobile young people willingly adopt stances of immobility as an attempt to bridge absence, in a weird inversion of contemporary torture techniques in which prisoners are forced to stand immobile as a way of creating self-inflicted solitude. Though Isophone's relation to absence would likely vary depending on context of use, it depends on an unpromising sensory premise, that any input from the present world is merely a distraction to achieving union with another. More contingent, even agitational conditions might help prevent this couple from sinking into the melancholy from the video's accompanying electronica soundtrack. Sensory solution sets Isophone's users up for a fall, through an initial promise of common space that eventually slams them back into knowing nothing, but what they hear, what they depend on from technology.